What would you do if one mistake shattered the life you built with the person you love most? This is the story of how I lost everything, and what it took to face the truth, seek forgiveness, and find out if love can survive betrayal. Years before meeting Jeff, my life was shaped by a series of impulsive decisions. Fresh out of college, I was eager to carve out my place in the bustling city. I landed my first job at a high-pressure marketing firm, where I met Sarah, a fiery and adventurous coworker. Sarah and I became fast friends, and she quickly pulled me into the vibrant city nightlife. Those carefree days were exhilarating, full of bold choices and unforgettable nights. But beneath all the excitement, there was a quiet longing I couldn't quite define. During that chapter of my life, I fell into a relationship with Mark, a man whose charm was only rivaled by his relentless ambition. Our romance burned bright, but it was far from smooth. Mark's obsession with success often created friction between us. Still, I convinced myself we were building something meaningful. That illusion shattered the day I discovered his betrayal. Heartbroken, I decided to leave the city behind. I sought solace in the quiet suburbs, which is where I eventually met Jeff. When Jeff entered my life, it felt like a much-needed breath of fresh air. He was everything Mark wasn't: steady, kind, and endlessly supportive. After a whirlwind romance, we got married, and for a while, life seemed perfect. Jeff's career in finance flourished, and we moved into a cozy home that quickly became our safe haven. I channeled my energy into making our house a warm, inviting space and nurturing our relationship. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of contentment. But as the years passed, the monotony of suburban life began to weigh on me. My job, while stable, lacked the spark and excitement I used to crave. And Jeff's demanding work schedule left me spending more evenings alone than I cared to admit. That familiar restlessness, the same one I thought I'd left behind in my youth, began creeping back into my life. It was during one of these stretches of loneliness that I started working on a collaborative project with Jim. Jim was nothing like Jeff. He was spontaneous, daring, and endlessly fascinating. His presence stirred something in me, something I had buried long ago. It wasn't just attraction, it was a reminder of the vibrant, risk-taking woman I used to be. Our professional relationship quickly turned personal. I found myself eagerly looking forward to our meetings, my heart racing with an anticipation that had nothing to do with work. It was a dangerous road, and deep down, I knew it. But the spark Jim reignited within me made it nearly impossible to turn away. Looking back, I can see how my choices were shaped by unresolved longings and insecurities I had carried for years. The adventurous, bold woman I once was had been subdued by the comforting stability of suburban life. Jim's arrival rekindled a part of me I thought I had lost forever, a hunger for passion, unpredictability, and excitement. And in my attempt to reclaim that spark, I found myself drifting further away from the life I had so carefully built. I set into motion a chain of events that would eventually shake the very foundation of my marriage. Restlessness and solitude had taken root in my life, leaving me yearning for something, anything, that might disrupt the monotony of my days. Maybe it was sheer curiosity or an unconscious desire to test boundaries that led me down this path. Jeff's demanding work schedule meant he was rarely home before dark, leaving me to fill the long hours after my own workday ended at 4:30. And then there was Jim. Confident, magnetic, and undeniably charismatic. As we worked together over time, our connection deepened in ways it never should have. What started as innocent, teasing exchanges soon crossed the line into something far more dangerous. One afternoon, after weeks of playful banter, Jim leaned in and kissed me. The move caught me completely off guard, and I instinctively stepped back, embarrassment and guilt flooding my thoughts. We laughed nervously, trying to downplay the moment, but it lingered, unsettling and confusing. That kiss awakened something deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Despite the guilt I carried as a married woman, the tension between Jim and me only grew. Soon after, he approached me again, his voice low and deliberate as he suggested a work trip to South Beach. The idea of spending time with him far from home, away from the routines and expectations of my life, felt exhilarating, almost intoxicating. Somehow, Jim even convinced our boss to bring me along. The night I told Jeff about the trip, he came home late, looking worn and exhausted. He dropped his briefcase on the table and sighed heavily. "Rough day?" I asked, trying to sound light-hearted. "You don't look it," I added with a smile. "I'm happy," he replied, offering a small, tired grin. "And I think you will be too when you hear what I have to say." Curious, I turned toward him. Jeff was standing silently by the table, his expression unreadable. But when our eyes met, he simply turned and walked out the door. I felt a flicker of guilt, but I brushed it aside as quickly as it came. I was too preoccupied with my own plans to notice that something was weighing heavily on Jeff's mind. That evening, he sat alone, staring quietly out the window. I should have known something was wrong. If I had taken the time to pause and reflect, I might have understood what he was feeling. But I didn't. I was too caught up in the excitement of what lay ahead. The morning of my trip, Jim offered to drive me to the airport, but Jeff insisted on taking me instead. On the way, the car was filled with a strained silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the traffic or my flight schedule. As we pulled into the drop-off zone, Jeff suddenly grabbed my hand. "Lauren," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I know I said I was okay with you going. But standing here now, I realize I'm not. I don't want you to go. It's not too late. Just tell them you can't make it and come home with me." "Jeff, you know I can't back out now," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The tickets are already bought, and my boss is counting on me." "I know I'm being selfish," he admitted, his tone thick with emotion. "But you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. If something happens, I just want you to remember that I love you." "I love you too," I said automatically, desperate to get through the gate and avoid the weight of his words. But Jeff wasn't finished. His grip on my hand tightened, his eyes searching mine. "Please, Lauren. Don't go." I pulled away gently, giving him a weak smile before walking toward security. My heart felt heavy, but I convinced myself I had no other choice. As I stepped into the terminal, a voice broke through my thoughts. "You know he doesn't know, right?" It was the woman behind the check-in counter, her tone quiet and cautious. I froze, confused and slightly irritated. "What are you talking about?" I snapped. "When he finds out," she continued in a whisper, "it'll break his heart." "You don't know what you're saying," I retorted, grabbing my things and walking away. But her words followed me, their weight impossible to shake. As I prepared to leave, she caught my hand and leaned in, her voice low but deliberate. "When he learns the truth, it won't just break his heart, it'll break yours too," she murmured. Her words struck deeper than I wanted to admit. Releasing my hand, she added softly, "The man behind you loves you more than you realize." I turned, shaken, and walked toward my gate. Later that evening, after settling into the hotel, I decided to call home to let Jeff know I'd arrived safely. I dialed our number, but there was no answer. Concern crept in as I tried again and again, each time met with silence. Jeff's earlier words about not seeing each other again echoed in my mind, leaving me uneasy. Finally, around 8 p.m., my phone rang. Seeing Jeff's name on the screen, I answered quickly, relief washing over me. "Hey, honey," I said. "I've been trying to reach you. I was worried when you didn't answer. Where have you been?" "Oh, I went out with some of the guys from work," he replied casually. His tone was light, but something about it felt distant. "They were talking up a storm," he continued. "I just got home." The conversation felt strained, like a hollow shell of what we usually shared. Sensing the tension, I forced a small laugh. "Well, we can talk now." There was a pause, and then Jeff's voice, quiet but firm. "Good night." "Good night, Jeff." "I love you," I blurted, the words spilling out before I could stop myself. Even with everything that had happened, I felt an overwhelming need to say it. "Good night," he replied simply, and then the call ended. As I sat there, phone in hand, a thought struck me like a cold breeze. Did he say he loved me back? He usually did. Maybe I missed it. Or maybe, he didn't. The uncertainty lingered, gnawing at me as the evening unfolded. Jim and I spent the rest of the night together, though the trip that was supposed to feel like freedom, a chance to indulge in excitement, now felt weighed down by an emotional fog. The next evening, as we returned to our room after dinner, I waited for Jeff's nightly call. But it never came. Strangely, instead of relief, I felt a simmering anger. Why hadn't he called? My irritation boiled over, and Jim bore the brunt of my mood. That night, there was no warmth or closeness for him. The next morning, hoping to clear my mind, Jim and I went for a walk along Lummus Park's boardwalk. We strolled past the iconic beach, scanning the area for any celebrities to liven up the morning, but there was no one worth recognizing. As we left the park, my phone buzzed. It was Jeff. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" I said cautiously. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. "I just needed someone to talk to. But I guess you're too busy for that." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, his words ringing in my ears. "You already know what it feels like to be without me, don't you?" What did he want? Jim asked, joining me on a nearby bench. I sighed, lowering the phone. He said he was lonely. He just wanted to talk. My voice faltered as I added, almost to myself, why did I lash out at him like that? Jim didn't miss a beat. "Lauren," he said gently but firmly, "we've been doing this for 6 months now. Maybe you're starting to lose interest in him. Maybe it's time to end things. Get a divorce, and we could be together for real. No more sneaking around." I looked at him, startled, but said nothing. The idea hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Later that day, Jim and I spent time lounging by the hotel pool. Wanting to make an impression, I slipped into a striking swimsuit and unveiled it with a laugh. "Well? What do you think?" I asked, spinning playfully. Jim grinned. "I think it's perfect." But before he could say more, a hotel staff member approached, looking uncomfortable. "Miss," he began awkwardly, "we've received complaints about inappropriate attire at the pool. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to cover up." Confused and embarrassed, I glanced around, noticing 2 parents with young children glaring in our direction. Flushing with shame, I quickly reached for a towel. That night, Jeff's words from earlier continued to haunt me. The weight of them lingered, tugging at something deep within me. For a moment, guilt began to stir, but I pushed it aside once again, retreating into the distraction of the life I had chosen, or maybe, the life I had let choose me. The faint sound of Jeff's voice on the call was quickly drowned out by Jim's interruption. His voice cut through the moment, pulling my attention away from the phone. Frustrated, I moved the phone away from my ear, covering the receiver as I hissed, "Be quiet." Jim backed off with a shrug, leaning casually against the doorframe, but the damage was done. I raised the phone again, trying to catch what Jeff was saying, but his words were already fading. Jeff's voice had been calm, almost measured. "You said it yourself," he began, "if I knew the truth, I wouldn't have let you go." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. Did Jeff know? Was he trying to tell me something? Jim, still lounging in the doorway, looked utterly unconcerned. "There's no way he knows," he said, his tone dismissive. "Think about it logically, Lauren. If he'd figured it out, he would have confronted you before you even left." I nodded, trying to convince myself that Jim was right. Jeff couldn't possibly know. But despite my best efforts to push the thought away, a nagging doubt refused to let me relax. Later that evening, when I still hadn't heard from Jeff, I decided to call my mom. My voice was shaky as I spoke. "Mom, I haven't heard from Jeff since Monday. Can you check on him at home? Please." Without hesitation, she agreed. "Of course, honey. I'll head over there now." 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Seeing our home number on the screen, my heart leapt. I quickly answered, hopeful. "Jeff? I'm so glad you called. Are you okay?" But it wasn't Jeff. My mom's voice came through instead. "It's me, Lauren," she said gently. "Jeff's not here. I've searched the entire house. He's gone." A cold wave of panic washed over me. I tried to steady my voice as I asked, "His car? Is it still there?" "No," she replied softly. "The car's gone too." I couldn't hide my fear any longer. "Mom, please, just keep trying to reach him. Let me know if you hear anything." She assured me she would, but as we hung up, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. For the first time, I began to realize that my marriage might truly be unraveling. Friday dragged by at a snail's pace, each hour more agonizing than the last. Unsurprisingly, Jeff didn't call that evening either. I tried his cell phone and the house line repeatedly, but both went straight to voicemail. The silence was deafening. My mind spiraled with worst-case scenarios, and Jim could sense the tension hanging over me like a storm cloud. For once, he didn't push for closeness or conversation, leaving me to wrestle with my thoughts alone. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to find any peace. The next morning, things took an unexpected turn. As Jim and I were checking out of the hotel, the concierge, Carlos, approached us with a calm yet serious expression. "Mr. Beckman," he said, addressing Jim with a polite nod, "there's something you need to see." Jim and I exchanged a puzzled look as Carlos placed two photographs on the counter. The first showed Jim sitting at the hotel restaurant. The second was of me, shirtless, by the pool on that ill-fated day. My stomach churned as Carlos began to explain. "A man came to me earlier this week and asked if I recognized these photos," he said matter-of-factly. "I told him you were registered under the name Beckman. You've made quite an impression here, especially after your little poolside performance." Carlos's words were laced with disapproval, and embarrassment rose hot in my cheeks. Jim grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "We need to leave," he muttered, his jaw tight. But before we could retreat, Carlos spoke again. "Oh, and Mr. Beckman. This is for you." He handed Jim a sealed envelope. Jim hesitated, his hand hovering midair before reluctantly snatching it from Carlos. He unfolded the note, and as his eyes scanned the page, his entire body stiffened. Without a word, Jim turned toward the large window overlooking the street, his expression unreadable. Slowly, the paper slipped from his hand and fluttered to the floor. I bent down to pick up the note, my hands trembling and my heart pounding. The message was blunt and scathing: "You thought you'd escape this. Pathetic." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt the walls of my world closing in. When I called my mom later to update her, I tried to sound casual. "It's nothing serious, Mom. Don't worry about it," I lied. But she wasn't buying it. "Lauren," she said slowly, her voice laced with concern, "this doesn't add up. For Jeff not to call or pick you up, it has to be something serious." There was a pause, then her tone shifted, quieter but sharper. "Oh my God, Lauren, what have you done?" Tears welled up in my eyes, spilling over as I choked out my reply. "I didn't do anything that can't be fixed. Please, Mom, just meet me at the airport. Just in case Jeff doesn't show." She sighed deeply, her voice tinged with finality. "If this is what I think it is, Lauren, he won't be there." There was a long silence before she added, "Don't worry, though. I'll come." The weight of her words sat heavily on my chest. Had Jeff overheard something? Could he have somehow recorded that phone call? The possibility made my stomach churn. I clung to the faint hope that he'd still be at Kennedy Airport, waiting to take me home. But deep down, I knew the chances of that were slim. On the plane, Jim sat silently by the window, staring out at the endless sky. Every time I glanced at him, his face bore the same blank, lost expression. I wasn't any better. The flight passed in a blur as I sifted through my guilt and dread. When we landed, my heart sank as I scanned the terminal. Jeff wasn't there. I wanted to believe he was running late, but I knew better. Beside me, Jim pulled out his phone and made a call. "Jane. It's me," he said softly. "Can you come pick me up?" There was a long pause before he ended the call with a defeated sigh. "She hung up," he muttered, his voice trembling. "She's not coming." Jim walked to a nearby bench and sat down, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying. My mom, ever the caretaker, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Come on," she said, glancing at me with a mix of pity and quiet judgment. "I'll take you both home." The car ride was suffocatingly quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived at the house, I was struck by its emptiness. It felt foreign, stripped of warmth. Jeff had had 4 days to prepare for this, and he had used that time to remove every trace of himself. I sank into the living room couch, struggling to process the reality of it all. My mom walked over, holding an envelope in her hand. Without saying a word, she handed it to me. On the front, written in Jeff's unmistakable handwriting, were 2 words: divorce papers. My stomach dropped as I stared at the envelope, unable to open it. My mom wasn't done, though. She reached into her bag and handed me a small jewelry box with a note attached. I hesitated before taking it, the weight of her disappointment crushing me. When I finally mustered the courage to open the note, I saw Jeff's familiar handwriting once again. The words were short but devastating: "You broke my heart, but I hope you find what you're looking for." Tears streamed down my face as I realized what I had done. My mom stood silently, her expression a mix of sadness and resignation. She didn't need to say anything, her silence and the sheer disappointment in her eyes were more cutting than words ever could be. Then, to my utter horror, she reached into her bag again and pulled out a small tablet. Without a word, she pressed play on a video. As I watched my own actions play out on the screen, my choices, my selfishness, my betrayal, I felt shame consume me. My mother had seen everything. The weight of her witness, of my choices laid bare, was unbearable. For the first time, I truly felt the full impact of what I had done. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive myself. It wasn't until the next part of the DVD played that I truly understood the depth of what I'd lost. This section wasn't a video, just audio. Jeff had clearly recorded his side of one of our phone calls. His voice was strained, breaking under the weight of his emotions. "You're doing this again," he muttered softly, almost to himself. I could hear the sound of fabric shifting, likely as he wiped his face with the hem of his t-shirt. His voice dropped further, a whisper edged with bitterness. "This is the second time she's done this to you, Jeff. Never again. Never again." The screen went abruptly black as Jeff shut off the camera. That was the end of the recording. Its purpose had been fulfilled, leaving me utterly broken. Beside me, my mother sat silently, her head bowed as tears streamed down her face. Her quiet sobs were almost unbearable to hear. Yet, even her pain couldn't compare to the crushing guilt and self-loathing I felt as I replayed Jeff's anguish in my mind. Seeing his heartbreak, hearing his tears, it was like watching the life I had so carelessly destroyed crumble into ash before me. Desperate to reach him, I picked up my phone and dialed Jeff's number. He hadn't answered any of my calls all week, and I braced myself for the possibility that this time would be no different. But to my surprise, he picked up after the second ring. "Lauren, what do you want?" he asked, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. "Jeff," I began, my voice trembling, "we need to talk. Please, will you talk to me?" There was a pause. Then, without a hint of warmth, he replied, "Tomorrow." "Whenever works for you," I whispered. "Tomorrow at 2, he said before abruptly ending the call. The next day, I arrived at the cafe early, nervously fidgeting as I waited. When Jeff walked in, he didn't look at me immediately. He moved with a quiet precision, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from me. His expression was guarded, his gaze sharp as he finally met my eyes. "What do you want to say, Lauren?" he asked coldly. I swallowed hard, my voice barely steady. "Jeff, I need to tell you how sorry I am." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. "I know what you're thinking, that I'm only sorry because I got caught, right?" His expression didn't change, but I could tell I'd hit the mark. "Yes," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry I got caught, but not for the reason you think. I regret starting the affair. I regret the choices that brought us to this point. But what I regret most is hurting you, the man who loved me more than I deserved." Jeff's eyes softened momentarily, but his face remained stoic. Then, after a pause, he spoke, his voice distant. "I used to watch you while you slept," he said quietly. "I'd trace the lines of your face, notice the way your nostrils flared when you exhaled, or how your lips would part slightly, like you were dreaming. And I told myself you were dreaming about me. But now I wonder if you were dreaming about him." I opened my mouth to respond, but he shook his head, silencing me. "I used to think I was the luckiest man alive to have you in my life," he continued, his voice raw with pain. "You were my angel, the light that made my dull, gray world vibrant. But now the light's gone. You took it with you." I couldn't hold back my tears as he paused, his hand trembling slightly as he rubbed his eyes with his thumb. "I told myself I'd never cry over you again," he said, his voice cracking. "But here I am." He stopped for a moment, collecting himself, before speaking again. "You asked about the video. You wanted to know what I meant when I said it was the second time I cried for you." "Yes, Jeff," I whispered. "Please tell me." He took a deep breath, his eyes clouded with sorrow. "Lauren, I fell in love with you the moment you stepped out of your dad's car that summer. Those months were the happiest of my life. But the worst moment," his voice faltered. "The worst moment came when you left me at the harvest dance." His words hit me like a tidal wave, memories of that long-ago day rushing back. I couldn't bear it any longer. Overwhelmed, I shot out of my seat, knocking my chair over in the process. "Don't go, Jeff," I pleaded, throwing my arms around him. My voice cracked with desperation. "Please, don't leave me." "I sobbed when I saw your letter at the hotel," I admitted through tears. "It hit me then just how badly I'd messed everything up. You and our marriage mean everything to me, Jeff. Please, forgive me. Please, come back." Jeff hesitated, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he pulled me into a gentle hug, his hand brushing through my hair in a way that felt both comforting and heart-wrenching. After a moment, he stepped back, placing his hands firmly on my shoulders and meeting my eyes with an intensity that made my chest ache. "Lauren," he began softly, his voice steady but filled with sadness, "I used to picture our future so clearly. I thought we'd grow old together, raising a family, building a life filled with love and trust. But now I can't see it anymore. That picture is gone." His words cut deep, but I couldn't deny their truth. I had shattered the foundation of everything we'd built together, and now, standing in front of him, I was begging for something I wasn't sure could be repaired. Months later, I found myself at a Memorial Day gathering at my parents' house. Stepping out the back door, I paused to take in the familiar view of the bluff overlooking the beach, the Connecticut coast visible across Long Island Sound. It was a sharp contrast to the days when Jeff and I had rented a modest house on Nassau's shoreline. Now, life was different, worlds away from those simpler times. Walking into the garage, I glanced at the 10 bays of our newly built space, each housing one of Jeff's beloved classic cars. After a moment's contemplation, I settled on the Thunderbird, a car that held more sentimental value than most. As I loaded our son, Jeff Jr., into the back seat, I couldn't help but think about how far things had come. It hadn't been an easy road. After our divorce was finalized, Jeff's life had moved on in ways I hadn't expected. He was introduced to Anna at a high-profile fundraiser hosted by his boss, Mr. Diamond, the president of the bank where Jeff worked. The Diamonds, despite their own marital struggles, had started a charity for Romanian orphans inspired by their adopted daughter. As one of Mr. Diamond's most trusted employees, Jeff had been expected to attend the $1,000 per plate event. That night, Anna had been seated beside him, a coincidence that would change the course of his life. She was elegant yet grounded, with a modeling career she had paused to pursue her true dream of starting a family. Jeff, she had said during their conversation, her voice steady and her gaze unwavering, the one thing I want more than anything is to have a child. Maybe even more than one. Jeff had grinned, his usual reserved demeanor softening. Then let's start now, he'd joked, prompting laughter that had broken the tension between them. A year and a half later, their son, Jeff Jr., was born. He quickly became the light of Jeff's life, a living reminder of the hope and happiness he'd managed to rebuild after the heartbreak of our marriage. As for Jim, his story had taken a different turn. I'd heard through whispers and fragments of rumors that he hadn't fared well after everything unraveled. His wife, Jane, had chosen to stay with him, likely for the sake of their children, but their marriage had been irreparably strained. For a time, Jeff had hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Jim. Whenever Jim got close to landing a decent job, rumors about his reliability, or lack thereof, would spread mysteriously, costing him the opportunity. This quiet campaign of sabotage continued until Jim and Jane began to suspect who might be behind it. One day, Jane called Jeff directly. Her voice was firm but filled with frustration as she asked, "Are you the reason Jim can't keep a job? Is this your doing?" Before I could respond, Cheryl spoke again, her voice trembling with emotion. I noticed, perhaps for the first time, how much she'd aged in the past 5 years. Our divorce had clearly taken a toll on her. Cheryl had always liked me, and when Lauren and I got married, she was overjoyed to welcome me into the family. "You would have been an amazing mom," I said softly, using the term she once asked me to call her. "You were a great mother to Lauren, and I know you would have been a wonderful grandmother too." Cheryl smiled faintly, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Jeff. I've missed you so much these past 5 years. And congratulations on everything you've accomplished." "Thank you," I replied sincerely. "I've been lucky enough to have had 2 amazing wives." "That's not true," Lauren interjected, her voice shaking as she shook her head. "I might have been attractive on the outside, but not on the inside." "That's not fair to yourself," I countered, looking at her intently. "You were beautiful inside and out." Lauren hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "Jim Beckman dazzled me." "Maybe it was something I did, something broken in me, that drove you away." "No," I replied firmly. "That's not it. Do you remember the dance with Billy Barber? What I did for you there?" Her eyes flickered with recognition before she looked away. "No, Jeff. It's not you. It's me. There's something broken inside me that ruins good things." She paused, struggling to find the words, before continuing. "I misunderstood so much back then. I thought you were putting me down. But later, I realized, you were proud of me. That changed how I felt about everything. That's when I started forgiving you." Her voice softened, and she looked up at me. "And thank you. For what you did for Jane Beckman. She called me in tears after she talked to you." I told her to reach out to you herself and even gave her your number at the bank." Lauren's expression wavered as she added, "She told me Jim finally got a job that could support their family. She wanted me to thank you." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm glad things worked out for them," I said quietly.